Sound and data.
I'd like to welcome Dolores Catherino to the Sound and Data podcast, and we were talking a little bit before I started the recording about the Lumitone research that she'd been doing. But why don't we first step back a step and just, can you give an overview of where you place yourself in the musical world, and then I'll explain why I think it's relevant to the Sound and Data, catalog of stuff.
Oh, sure. Well, I think that it's almost a parallel direction to maybe the spectral movement, where you're focused on the sound and tone color or timbre. And here, because I'm a multi-instrumentalist and these new innovative keyboards are coming out, you can really get down and start to appreciate and work with pitch color. I use the word pitch color because we don't really have a word in English for this type of quality that you would distinguish different shades of flat or sharp. And it just seemed like the most intuitive way to pursue it. And so really I'm trying to create those sonic composites. And what happens when you start to get it to finer pitch resolutions, like over 100 notes in an octave, you start to create new structures, maybe out of beat frequencies or phase interactions. And this is just so amazing. It's a whole nother world. It's almost pushing me away from composition toward trying to research what is this new phenomena that's happening in the music.
Okay, so part of the problem I've had with all of this is, I came at this as a composer, and then I did some pieces in the early 90s that used U.S. Geological Survey data. And I didn't realize I was doing sonification at the time. I was more like post-cage, just using it as a procedural determinant. But I have to say, just before that, I'd been working with Lou Harrison and Terry Riley, and very much into the intonation theory. And I met Erlingwald a bunch of times, and Wilson is another guy.
Irv Wilson.
Irv Wilson, amazing. Just amazing work in this area. And then had a long-time collaboration with Pauline Oliveros, who also played in just intonations quite a bit. And so I'm very familiar with that as a compositional thing. And then I've kind of gone on this sonification side, I got pulled, just, it was like kind of a intellectual interest, but also people were paying me to do research in that area. And so, so I'm trying to come back, I guess, and seeing your work really inspired me to, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I think there's a space where the representation of data can be mapped into this polychromatic space, and use the emotional contours that you identify very clearly in a lot of all of the talks I've heard. I've followed you pretty closely on the social media and stuff, and your ideas about, like, yeah, sure, a major third, but there's probably 3 or 4 major thirds that we can identify, depending on whether you're using just intonation or 72 equal or, any one of these various intonations. And they all have an emotional quality, and it's very non-linear. So the comparison of, I know this is going on a little long, but I just to make it clear my perspective on what's going on, I think these things are very healing. They're also very intuitive. And therefore, they represent a kind of information that's hard to articulate any other way. There's not a visual equivalent. There isn't a smell that's the same as this. But there is a feeling that happens when you play that just in tone major third. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm trying to find, okay, how do you find that place where the information is at its right point, and you understand that there... And then last week, I discovered that there's this harmonic analysis that stock traders do, and they call it harmonic analysis. And they're looking basically for intoned, and they do it based on the Fibonacci sequence, which is kind of interesting. But they do these undertones and overtones of occurrences of cycles in stock trading. And I went like, that's as much as I know.
Yes,
okay, so I'm going on and on. I'm trying not to do that, but I just wanted to establish. So
Well, it's really interesting when you talk about just intonation.
Right.
And I guess being able to work with many more pitches on an equally divided scale,
Right.
what I found that just intonation is like a placid lake, just beautiful, and it has this stasis to it, or a calmness to it.
Right.
But what happens when you use the intervals outside of just intonation, then you're able to add different types of texture or movement or structure to it. And that's when it really feels like it opens up into more dimensions, when you get beyond the just intonation system.
Right. I mean, I'm thinking of, I'm also a guitarist. I play keyboard quite a bit, but when you're tuning a guitar, you get very close, it's just, but there's also this beautiful phasing that happens as things are just out of tune, especially 3 or 4 voices that are just about on pitch. You get chorusing effects.
Oh, yes.
Curtis Rhodes had this micro sound book that's about that space from, well, just that, what they call the Pythagorean comma, right near the pitch. Anyway, so,
Yeah.
When you're constructing these things, are you intuitively just composing freely, or what kind of systems do you use to construct your polychromatic things? And we'll of course leave links in the text that accompanies the podcast for people to listen to your work and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I would say that it's a very intuitive system, and somebody had asked me about that on YouTube, about, is the description that I put with the piece, is that what the piece is about? And it's not really that. It's just that at that snapshot, that moment of time, that process, the creative mind is working on this thing, while the analytical mind is thinking about other things and other implications.
Right.
It's that they're superposed. They're happening at the same time, but that's not what the music is about.
Right.
So generally, it's been, since I'm a multi-instrumentalist, my approach has always been, not to force creativity. I'm always working on hearing these intervals and practicing different configurations.
Right.
And then once you start to say, oh, that was weird, that sounds good, and then you go in that direction, then the time is really ripe to get into that exploratory mode. But I never force it. I never have a structure that way.
That makes me think of actually asking about your path. You're multi-instrumentalist. You were originally a woodwind player, right?
Sax player, yes.
Yes, sax player.
Before that, my parents aren't musical, so everybody here and there was saying, "Oh, your daughter has musical talent," and my dad's like this scientist, so he's like, "Well, you have to have the master instrument. I'm getting you an organ." It was the first transistor organ by Hammond in the '70s.
Wow!
And it's like, how uncool is that? What do you play? The organ.
Yeah. Well, mine was the accordion, so I was right in there.
Yeah, right, exactly.
But Pauline flipped that on its head, actually, and Guy Klusevic made the accordion hip again. But anyway.
I think the last straw was like, somebody saying something to the effect of, "Are you going to go play in the roller skating rink?" Remember that old organ music? It's like, oh, no.
Oh, yeah, right.
Not happening.
Yeah, well, at least they didn't get you a Lowry, I guess. Which is the...
But and that was the first time I really got that sense of the Leslie speaker.
Right.
And it always seems like when you disengage the Leslie speaker and it slows down its rotation, my sense was that it felt like it was stretching time. And I didn't know mathematically what's going on, but it just felt like, and you don't really have words for it, but that's what it seemed like. You're stretching time. And so that kind of started that process of my ears trying to put together non-pitch, non-harmony kind of
But you're,
construct.
as a saxophone player then, after you clearly put down the organ completely and started playing more saxophone, you were playing jazz then mostly, or was it rhythm and blues, or so straight ahead?
Always loved jazz. I was a terrible sight reader, and the way that I practiced my horn was Jerry Coker's Patterns for Jazz.
I know the book.
I've never seen it. He writes out the pattern in 2 or 3 keys, and then it's just dot, 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 dot. So you had to learn those patterns.
Right.
And that was really the basis of my technique. Was always much more rudimentary than traditional jazz players that might learn a lot of transcribed solos or tunes and that kind of thing. I just wanted to know the language.
Yeah, that's pretty much the way I did it too, actually. I learned this shortcut. A friend of mine, on the piano showed me that the major seven on the minor third, they're just tricks you can do. And I thought of that because I'm watching the way you play, and you're using sort of patterns as well, the way you construct the harmonic thing, since you generally use a 72 equal or 53 or 31 or 17 or one of those, right?
Well, whatever the keyboard can handle. So,
okay. You take it as max as you can go. Yeah.
The microphone can handle 72.
Uh-huh.
And then with the Lumitone, it just opened my eyes to the idea of getting rid of accidentals altogether.
I really like that. I just saw that video that you posted, and the idea that the white notes and then C sharp, 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 or flat, 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 flat.
Yes.
That's really that's actually what's going on anyway. I mean, on staff notation, there isn't some differentiation between C and C sharp. They reside in the same place on the staff, so that helps your notation problem too. Because as long as you can color the note heads, you can use like Sibelius or Finale or Muse Tone or Muse Note or whatever. I forget the open source one, which I've been using lately. But anyway.
Every couple of years, I send a request into Finale to see if they would implement colored pitch. And they're just like, nope, not going to happen.
Yeah.
But what they do, you can assign one color per pitch, per composition, per score. And so that's not helpful. So I have to just export it into Affinity Designer and then add a layer of color on top of the score.
Yeah. Well, one of the guys I interviewed, which you might be interested in, Martin, what was his last name? I can't remember, but he did on YouTube, he sort of does this e-blast on sonification, which is how I found him. And nice. He's a really interesting guy, though. He's working for MuseScore is the name of it, which is the open source Muse thing. And so he knows those developers. I mean, that might be a path to get some open source guy who gets interested in your thing to avail you of colored fonts.
Well, I have that shortcut, and the thing that's really capturing my imagination now is if you take a listen on YouTube to the latest composition that I posted, Outer Worlds,
right?
And if you start to time shift it, what happens is it totally transforms the piece. And so I talked to my father, who's a scientist. He said, yes, when you change the duration, the beat frequencies are changed.
Right.
They're stretched, so you totally transform it.
Right.
And the first thing I'm thinking about was this is communications theory, because in theory you could embed signals and data that are accessed by shifting the time stretch to say 1.32, and then all of a sudden this new sonic construct pops out.
Part of the problem in the research that I was mentioning earlier, part of the thing is it's not that it's hard to embed information into audio, but it's hard to communicate that it's been embedded. In other words, 1.32 and 1.36 are going to be yeah, and yeah. You'll be able to hear that differentiation, but at the same time, someone probably even hearing your music wouldn't know you were playing on a special keyboard if they were just listening. They'd have this experience that something's a little bit, what's going on here? But they don't know the sort of very precise background that's happening that you're realizing with the keyboard, Well,
and that was kind of the point, was to have enough of a bridge that it wouldn't alienate people. So you start to hear it, and the more you hear it, the more you hear, because you're starting to hear the micro pitches and how they interact. And then if you try to play it on a piano or on your horn, you're like, oh, that's not what's on the piano.
Yeah,
but it doesn't sound way out there.
Well, and it's interesting. It's why probably the guitar is such an expressive instrument, because the guitarist can just bend the pitch to where it fits, and that happens intuitively. I mean, B.B. King was doing it all the time, to get that blues tone.
Right.
And
so emotional.
But so there's this space between the emotional reaction, which is very clear in your music to me. Anyway, I get an emotional resonance, and Pauline's was the same way. I've got to say, her music, I felt, I wasn't being analytical at all, and yet I know she was very thoughtful about, and you are as well, about the construction of how that. I mean, she used her intuition, but she also structured things so that they had a contour and a destination that happened. Do you feel like you do that with the way you're working with material?
Yeah, but not in an analytical sense. It's more based on prior experience. So everything you've heard and all your training in jazz, and so you say, that doesn't quite work. It's not that. I'm not thinking analytically at all.
Uh-huh.
So it's not purely intuitive. It's really based on the past musical experience.
Right. The way you listen to, the way you hear your own experience with music
Right.
in the music you're making. Well, I'm trying to find the bridge here because, this is always a problem for me because I have these two hats, you're mentioning your father as the scientist, and I'm always working with scientists, but I'm coming from more from the space you're coming from. Mm-hmm. So if you were presented with that problem, how would you approach it?
With what problem?
Well, the problem of trying to emotionally, I guess, represent a data meaning. I don't know how, this is a hard question, actually.
Yes.
There was a guy, Michael Winter, who I interviewed, who was actually working on sonifications of emotion. And it's an area that I'm very interested in, and I think the microtonal thing is part of that. But I know it's outside of your bailiwick, but do you have any thoughts?
Well, it's so interesting because, I have some medical training, so I'm very interested in the ideas of resonance and how different sonic effects can resonate with the body.
Right.
And, the way they're already used in therapeutics with ultrasound and infrasound with lithotripsy and this type of thing. And then communications theory of just, how do you embed data within sound signals? And if we talk about complex, not only complex sounds, but complex harmonic progressions, are there other dimensions where very intense sets of data could reside?
Right.
But that's probably more like cryptography or encryption or encoding, something like that.
Which is kind of the opposite. I want to decrypt.
Okay.
And there's also, it's weirdly assuming some sort of form of reality where data itself has a kind of, I wouldn't say beauty, but some sort of sound that's identifiable. And that might not even be true. That could be a false narrative that so that's the story I'm telling myself.
Right. Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine data having an emotional component. It seems so utilitarian. You're trying to communicate some kind of a signal that expresses something. Well, but you don't think of it as emotional expression. I guess, right?
Right.
That's so subjective. What would the message be?
Right. Like Mondrian, as a painter, looks very analytical. And the one place that comment made me think of is Reddit. Has this sub-channel called Data is Beautiful, which I tend to follow. And it's all these beautiful renditions, graphics of data that are rendered by graphic designers to be beautiful or to convey the information more clearly through beauty. And I think that might be the direction that I'm sort of, this is really early days.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But you can see why I was so attracted to your work, because it's sort of right in there. I mean, you're making very multidimensional expression that clearly has more definable parameters than standard musical notation, and so that's actually where my interest. Besides being very interested in your music just as music, I'm not trying to. But I think there is a bridge there, possibly. I could be wrong. It's just an intuition. But
I've never thought about it that way. Yeah, I guess it's almost like the two sides of the brain are separated for me in that sense, where I'm kind of a romantic style composer in philosophy mainly, where I have hope and I believe in transcendence and that we have a purpose here, hopefully to do good things,
right.
And just an optimistic approach or philosophy. But then the other side, that analytical side, is the data side, or the when you talk about emotion, then all of a sudden I'm thinking about psychology.
Right.
So it moved me out of the aesthetic realm and the philosophical realm over to the other side, which is, okay, well, what do you mean by emotion? How would we measure it? And really, data is all about measuring, whereas music is so qualitative.
Right.
And
And the weird part of mapping music to this whole thing is that thing that when you're in China, people are laughing. You don't know what they're saying, and they also love Chopin, or they love, probably the Beatles, or, they resonate, or there is resonance. They would probably love your music and not, they would, in other words, there's a place where music is kind of universal. Not absolutely, but there is this kind of weird space. I guess that's where, do you have any ideas or thoughts about that?
Yeah, because for me, the sense of music being a universal language
Right.
is not in the discursive sense where you're conveying direct, clear ideas. It's more in this sense of how we perceive things as beautiful. And a lot of that is cultural, because over time we've learned to appreciate more dissonance as beautiful.
Right.
And so with the polychromatic extension, I'm thinking of dissonance as this tension, these ripples in the lake that are coming from different directions, and how are they interacting? And yes, a just intonation triad sounds so beautiful and perfect, but I love all the agitation and the waves and the dynamic movement. It almost symbolizes evolution, that it just keeps progressing.
Well, what the listener would know is I shared Parch's The Barefooted Bride, or whatever, where he sort of maps that contour, the approach to each one of the just intervals across the octave. I can maybe include that in the notes for the podcast, because it is a visual representation of exactly what you're talking about. Because there is a place where it is in just intonation, and all the shimmering stops, and it goes boom, and all of a sudden it becomes absolutely spectral and almost timbral, actually.
Yes.
Which is the most fascinating part of it. And it's that tension between being spectral and being harmonic that's so interesting to me. I think that's the space.
Oh, yeah. But I kind of wonder if it's like the Necker cube, the three-dimensional cube, where you see two different orientations,
right,
but only one at a time, or the face-vase illusion.
Right.
That if you try to put timbre or tone color together with pitch color, which is very high resolution pitch, and those effects, that maybe it just seems like it would be too much information to focus on how they would integrate. You'd have to focus on one angle and then go back to the other angle. But I don't know, that stuff fascinates me. Could we learn to really hear both together as an integrated consciousness?
This is an area where John Chowning and James Beaucamp were doing a lot of research. The Bohm scale. They made it special clarinets that play in this intonation called the Bohm intonation, where the octave is actually stretched. Yeah, it's really far out and kind of unsettling music. One thing I have to say is your music is microtonal, but it's approachable much more than a lot of the experimental music that I've listened to. And, I followed this stuff for years. The Cutler brothers played with Lamont Young. I don't know if you heard Just Stompin'. Do you know that piece?
No.
Well, you might. I'll send you a link on the email. It's interesting. It's Lamont Young did this kind of really long time frame blues in just intonation, and the Cutler brothers are playing these guitars with 42 frets per octave, and it's in the zone with the kind of space we're talking about. But it's a blues. It's a stomping blues that's in this weird just intonation thing, and very interesting. And my experience of it was almost like Gershwin in a way. At certain times, you'd get this feeling of what Gershwin was after in Rhapsody in Blue or something like that. This is a very ahead of our time place that I'm asking you to comment on. But you have such insight. It's just so obvious in your music. Is there any other thing you'd like to bring to the table relative to it that you can think of?
Well, just that it really, is it's this wonderful convergence between these innovators that develop these keyboards, like Lippold and Aaron Hunt, and so as a musician, you actually have the capability, which Parch didn't have, or any of the other guys didn't have, to go beyond, for Parch 43 notes, or other guys 24 notes per octave, and to just take your imagination as far as that keyboard can go. I mean, my main battles are with MIDI.
Right.
So,
Right.
They say 2.0, but it sounds like it's going to be quite a while.
Have you looked at the instrument at all?
Yes, I'm trying to work with that right now. It really was designed for a chromatic scale, so I have to figure out a way around that. But I really would like to see how, other than kind of a guitar or stringed instrument technique, how you can use it technically as opposed to the hexagonal keys.
Right. I mean, another thing I thought of looking at the Lumitone was the hex layout of accordions from the European. But they use the cycle of fifths, which is a whole different configuration of the hex thing, where the adjacent notes are basically, what is that, the tonez configuration that Euler made in the 18th century. I don't know if you know that, but it's basically, it's a whole thing. Yeah. I'm nerding out here.
Some of the earlier hexagonal keyboards were assigned pitches with those modal intervals around them in a similar way.
Right.
But I think that's the distinction with a polychromatic system, is it's almost like a jazz musician. You lay it out so you can play in every single key color.
Right.
Whereas, you have all your intervals right here, and every scale is isomorphic in the same pattern, all of this, but you can't get in between them, because it's like chunk. The pattern is chunks.
So polychromatic, is that your term? That's your term for your layout, or was there a precursor tonal? It's the first I've heard. I mean, you're the one who speaks in the vocabulary the most that I can think of. I mean,
well, it made sense to me, being from different backgrounds of when you add color to a black and white keyboard. Then, by definition, polychromatic. But take that concept further, and it's interesting how it developed further all the way to the Lumitone, where you're just like, okay, let's simplify the chromatic system and expand more into the polychromatic realm. So you can just go A through G, and then, continue down that whole other dimension of color.
Not to be confused with polytonal, which would be like Mio and those guys, who are basically playing in two 12 equal tempered keys at once, like
no, this is more of a learning system.
Right.
You want to play, and that was the thing that held me back as a musician. I don't know how many other people, it's the same thing of just like, I want to be able to work with all these different systems. I don't want to have to learn new terminology and new notation symbols. If I'm going from 24 to 31, or just make it generalized, so I can move back and forth or play in two different temperaments at the same time.
Well, I did have the opportunity of playing some stuff that I was doing, which was algorithmic music based on geodesic math.
Oh, wow.
This a while ago. Lou Harrison was still alive, and I played it in 19 equal for Lou Harrison. And he wouldn't have it. He was just intonation is the only intonation. It was even a quote of Lou Harrison. Wow. He was kind of dogmatic about that.
Isn't that interesting, though? I mean, people are very strongly in that just intonation realm. But for me, the natural state of pitch is a continuum. So just intonation is just as arbitrary as equal divisions. It's just what our mind decides to superimpose on the continuum to break it up into pitches. So it's almost like you're agnostic in that sense, where, okay, divide it any way you want, but realize the natural state is a continuum. Right.
I mean, it'd be like the RGB in color theory, or CYMK, these are arbitrary, distinct, magenta, yellow, what is cyan, magenta, yellow, and I forget what K stands for, but,
black, I think.
Yeah, black, right. These are distinct color destinations that you combine at a different resolution of value between them to print any color. Yes. And I think the same thing's true here, where C, D, E, F, G, and A are sort of the markers, but you have the polychromatic zone between each of those destination colors or
Yes.
tonal settings. So it's
And even though it's a modal layout, you can play any chromatic scale on it. So it's not like a modal layout. It's still chromatic. It just even extends the chromatic system without using black notes or accidental.
You know what? This makes me think of doing something using this, doing a sonification using this polychromatic, divide everything into, what would it be, 7 divisions, and then use your polychromatic theory, and of course attribute you completely, and see if people, can hear these destination, with the shimmering you were talking, the lake shimmering metaphor, because people need a story. If they don't know the story, they don't know how to listen.
Yes, right.
For information or for emotion or for whatever.
Right, right.
Wow, fantastic! This is
it is pretty exciting time.
Okay, well, I don't want to go on and on. We try to make this the length of a workout or something.
Okay.
But Dolores, this is so gracious of you to spend your time with me on and talk about these ideas. And of course, Kathy was flagging me in the background saying, you're talking too much. I'll let Dolores have her word. But we've really covered a lot of territory, and I look forward to talking to you again if you'd be into it. Maybe I'll try to realize something in one of these intonations and get your feedback on it, and we can continue the dialogue regarding this weird space between the analytic and the non-analytic listening to sound relative to information.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Well, let's call that the Sound and Data channel with Dolores Catherino will return in the future.
Sound and data.